Thank you so much, and I'm glad that we managed to get to do this. The time zone with Stanford wasn't that easy, so I'm finally in Europe, and the time zone makes it much easier to have this seminar together. We were discussing it before. Please feel free to jump in and ask questions as I go along. Otherwise, there's a perfectly fine video of one of my co-authors presenting online. So the point of doing it together is to interact, and I kept the presentation relatively short to allow for maximum interaction. The better people on the paper are my co-authors. Chris Clayton is at Yale, Antonio Coppola is at Stanford, and Jesse Schrager was at Columbia. And this paper is part of a research agenda that we've been working on for a few years now, thinking about geoeconomics and economic statecraft. So first, what is geoeconomics? I guess a few years ago, I had to define this much more than these days, given how much it's in the news. But it's the idea that hegemonic governments use their economic strength from existing financial and trade relationship to achieve either geopolitical goals or economic goals. And so there's many prominent examples of this. Certainly, it's in the news a lot these days, but you can think of the US government imposing export controls in semiconductors, trying to prevent China from acquiring some of this technology. You can think of the reverse, as China threatening to cut off the supply of rare earths or products that are downstream of rare earths, particularly to the US, and perhaps in retaliation to the first bullet point. You can also think of episodes that are a mix of many things. For example, the Trump administration use of tariffs as a negotiation tools. Now, probably the closest to a geoeconomic use is telling Colombia that they're going to face tariffs unless they let some planes land, or trying to influence the political and judicial process in Brazil. There are certainly other reasons why the administrations might do tariffs, and these instruments are instruments and they're not the goal. What is the problem with measuring these pressures and how it affects firms' behavior? Well, first, is that the pressure can be indirect. The typical example I'm going to use is the US using a company in the Netherlands called ASML that does advanced lithography machines to put pressure on China or to prevent them from developing more of a semiconductor industry. Plus, the tools can be very different. In the examples I mentioned, export controls and tariffs, but you can also think of sanctions. You can think of indirect softer pressures. Similarly, the way the target might respond, it's very wide. So in some sense, what the ask was, what I was trying to get you to do when I applied the pressure, and how you respond, it's not easy to measure in straightforward hard data because very often this can be across multiple domains. And probably more obviously, some of these threats do not get realized. The sanctions that we have in mind or the export controls that we have in mind are very often on path. But if you can think of like forms of pressure where I really have a huge amount of influence over you, you might comply without me ever on path imposing any of the tools. And so we have to think of ways to do measurement that do not rely on just the ones that we see in sample. So what this paper does, it looks at firm level corporate text combined with large scale replicable LLMs. And I'll spend some time on this. I assume that this is unfamiliar to many people. It was certainly unfamiliar to me. I wanted to get into this about 2 years ago. And as usual, one way to get into a new technique is to just do research and pay the cost of learning. So I'll tell you what I know, and I'm very happy to take questions or comments and suggestions. What is sort of the main advantage? The first is you can do this in real time. I mean, corporate text comes out very fast. Not quite as fast as news, but really close to real time. And the firms are telling about many types of pressure that can affect them. We're going to try to characterize how geoeconomics pressure gets applied around the world. So I'll start from the very top, sort of what are the episodes, who's applying it to whom, but then I'll try to sort of dig deep into which firms are being used, which firms are being targeted, and also think about the response of the firms. How is the firm responding across potentially many, many different options? Think about, for example, are they facing higher input pricing? Are they passing on some of these input prices to customers? Are they doing different investments? Because, for example, they might have lost access to a certain technology and they're doing investment and R&D to compensate for it. Are they reshuffling their supply chains? And that's really going to be the core of the paper. And then because these techniques are very new, and of course they are prone to measurement error, I'm going to start thinking a little bit more carefully about quantifying measurement uncertainty via model and prompt perturbations. And this is something that we're still actively working on. I think the entire literature is trying to figure out techniques to deal with the noise and potential bias in this model. So I'll give you a list, our initial thoughts on this. There's a lot of literature. I'm not going to get into it, but I'm very happy to ask questions as we go along. I would say that just at the very high level, we're really into two different camps. On the technique side, there's clearly a very long list starting, probably most prominent with my colleagues at Stanford, like Nick Bloom, thinking about text. We're going to use more specifically some of the text that Tarek Hassan has brought to the literature on corporate. There is a nascent literature on AI that we're also sort of related to. And then on the content side, there's clearly a big literature in both economics and political science on sanctions, economic statecraft. I would say the literature in geoeconomics, within the economics part, it's much more recent, but it's growing very, very fast. So let me sort of give you a structure of what we're going to do, okay? This is a list how I conceptualize what we did. So start from the left, okay? The basic thing is the documents. So what source of text are we using? And we're really using earning calls. So these are CEOs and CFOs that publicly listed firms around the world that talk about what's happening to the firm into a conference call with investors. One part might be scripted and one part might be open Q&A. And this is really what, for example, Tarek Hassan and his quotas have used before. There is selection. They're clearly large firms. They're public. The biggest shortcoming of the data set that most people have been using is the almost complete absence of Chinese firms. We managed to circumvent that. We acquired data from a provider called Orbit that has the transcripts of the Chinese firms. So it's going to be very important for this particular paper, given that China is both the receiving end and the country applying the pressure. And so their firms are very involved into this. Of course, because these are the firms talking about themselves, I mean, first, I'm not going to take any stand whatsoever on whether the firms are correctly reporting, correctly forecasting their actions. All I'm interested in is what are they saying? There's a literature that already exists that shows that what they actually say does matter for what they actually do, but I'm not going to take a stand on that. I do have to worry, however, about political incentives that are endogenous to the pressure. To make it blunt, think of a sitting US CEO. It might feel free to criticize China as much as they want, but they might feel very hesitant to criticize the US administration, particularly if they're under pressure. And so for that, what we're going to do is we're going to use analyst reports. So these are analysts in investment banks, in professional analysts that talk about the firm. And being more arm's length, they're much less likely to be affected by this. The second reason why we'll use that data source is first to explore whether we get similar results across potentially very different text, but also because the analysts help us with the coverage. Think of, for example, trying to cover Russia. Russian firms, as they get sanctioned more and more heavily, are going to stop having conference calls in English with foreign investors. But analysts will still talk in English about what might be happening to the Russian economy across sectors and firms. And so that really helps us getting rid of some of the lack of coverage that might also be endogenous. Okay, so that's a text base. The second thing at the bottom is the prompts. So for those of you that have never done this, like And what is a prompt? It's essentially a long list of instruction that in the old days you would have given an array that says, please read this document, and I will ask you to answer the following 55 questions that ask them things like, is the firm affected by sanctions or by export controls? Which country is imposing this policy? Which country is being the target of the policy? Is the firm suffering on its inputs? For example, is it facing higher prices on the inputs? Are the firm's products being targeted? If so, which ones? And how is the firm responding? Are you planning to increase your investment? If so, in which countries? Are you planning to increase your sale prices? So think of formulating all of this long set of instructions that normally you would have given to some arrays to manually code up and feeding them instead to an LLM. So the box in the middle, it's the model. And in the particular confines of what we're going to do, we're going to concentrate on open weights models that are general purpose. In particular, for a lot of the talk, we use a model called Llama that it's made available by Meta. But we've also experimented with Gemma, which is from Google, and Q1 from Alibaba. Okay, so think of the model as getting a document, a set of instructions, and what it really returns, it's a hard data set. A hard data set in the sense that it's a structured data set with the answers to all these 55 questions. And the answers might come in the form of a 0-1 flag, is the firm affected or not? Or they might come in the form of a 3-letter ISO code for a country. Which country is imposing the policy? The algorithm might reply USA, or it might be less structured. And for example, it might say, describe in a few words which of your products or inputs are affected by the policy. And so the algorithm might reply, semiconductors or GPUs or something like that. Okay, and that then we're going to have to code up. Okay, that's the structure of the paper. And so all of the analysis is about the structured output, and the production is how to get to the structured output from the text. So before we get into what the results are, there's, I guess, two conceptual questions at least. One is, how did you come up with the questions? And two, how did you come up with the documents? And why does that combination make it interesting? So that's part of a broader project that over the years we developed with our co-authors on geoeconomics. So I'm going to try to sketch it at a level of relatively superficial, but just enough to understand why we're asking the questions in that particular way. So let me start with an example. I'm going to pick ASML. This is a Dutch firm that, as I said, does lithography, advanced lithography machines that are essential in the production of semiconductors and chips. So think of this firm as a value function undisturbed, where Z is a set of aggregates, aggregate demand, prices, all of the aggregate state variables. And X star is his own private first best choice, sorry, private optimal choice of actions. Where does he buy? Where does he sell? All of those things, okay? Now think of the US government coming around and saying, look, I would like you to change what you're doing. Of course, the US doesn't have direct legislative power over the firm. This is a foreign firm. So it's very different from what we typically think about, which is influencing a domestic firm, where the government has many direct powers, including regulations, tariffs, export controls. There's lots of stuff that you can do on your own firm. So this is a foreign firm. And they don't want to take the action. So the action that the US wants is for ASML to stop selling to China and servicing the existing machines that are in China that they produce. This is clearly privately costly for SML. It wouldn't want to comply. So how do you induce it? Well, the first thing that you might do is you might give them a threat and say, look, if you don't do what we're asking you to do, in the particular case of ASML and the US government, allegedly, the US government threatened the firm with imposing what is called FDPR, Foreign Direct Product Rule, which is essentially a rule of the US that says as long as you use any inputs coming from the US, we're going to regulate you directly or prevent you from having access to these inputs. As that's a very powerful threat for a firm that uses a lot of US technology. Now that one, if you think about it, what it's doing is it's shifting the value function to the left. If the threat is realized, ASML will suffer a large loss. So the gap in the middle is the power of the US government over the firm. It's essentially a set of actions that are costly for that firm to undertake, but where the firm will voluntarily comply in order not to face the consequences of the threat being realized. Of course, you can phrase everything in terms of a sweetener. The US could give more contracts to ASML if he complies and move it to the right. Okay, but fundamentally, a lot of what we ended up doing in our theory work has been modeling these concepts of geoeconomic power as a participation constraint where you generate surplus, the difference between the inside option and the outside option for the firm. And the gap in the middle tells you how much leeway do you have as an imposing government for asking for costly actions, for things that you would like. And the costly actions could be very generic. It could be stop selling to China. It could be, I want you to lobby your own government for this particular political outcome. I think all they have in common is being privately costly for the target. So I'm going to really use throughout the talk this framework of there's a government that is applying the pressure, there is a country or a firm that is the target of the pressure. In this case, they're the US and China. And then there are the means of the pressure, which in this case, ASML is in some sense, is a bystander. It's being used in this relationship to apply pressure. And then the tools, which are in this case is an export control. I don't want you to sell to China. Okay. Good. So imagine trying to feed this into the data. How would you do it? So what we did is we collected all of the transcripts and analyst reports on US suppliers to ASML, ASML itself, and potentially from Chinese customers of ASML, like SMIC in China. And across this supply chain, we're asking the LLM to tell us whether the firms are reporting anything about pressure. And in this particular case, ASML reports get flagged multiple times from the algorithm over the period 21 and 25 about being the recipient of pressure. And the country, when you inspect what the LLM produces in terms of hard fields, it will say that the country imposing the controls are the US and the Netherlands. In this particular case, the Netherlands enters because part of the pressure on ASML was the US government pressuring the Netherlands government to impose regulation on ASML. The country receiving the export controls is China. The firm's products are EUV and DUV system. So these are precisely those lithography tools that I was mentioning. The overall impact on the firm is negative. The firm reports the profits being lower because of this. In particular, it reports lower sales, and where it says, oh, look, it's in China. And then, of course, we can look at the Chinese customers, and we're going to spend a lot of time thinking about how they're reacting. Are they trying to find different suppliers? Are they trying to do domestic R&D to produce these things themselves? And we're going to look at that. But that's sort of conceptually what we're doing. So if there are no questions, let me jump into at least the high-level results, okay, just to get warmed up, and then we're going to go deeper and deeper. So at the very, very high level, this is a very simple plot, is the fraction of firms in the data set that report being affected by sanctions. That's the headline number. And then we decomposed it in who did they report imposing the sanctions and towards whom. And so these drive with things that you already know, that, for example, in 2022, there is a massive spike. It's largely the US and Europe imposing sanctions on Russia. But then if you look a little closer, there's a lot of variation. For example, in the period of 2018, 2022, you see the US imposing sanctions on Iran, but you also see the US imposing sanctions on China. Those, for example, are the US targeting Huawei and ZTE there. You also see some US to Russia. And then you see another spike in 14, where you have the earlier invasion of Crimea from Russia and the first bout of sanctions. You can, of course, do a lot more. You can look at tariffs, and here you find the two Trump administrations. And you can see that the current one, this data I think runs to the beginning of June, when we last ran the algorithms. And you can see that there's a massive spike after April 2nd, of the firms mentioning tariffs. If you look at export controls, it's kind of interesting. There's a lot of actions. In particular, this is an instrument that has been used a lot by the US administration. It's part of even the Biden administration idea of putting a high fence around a very small garden. So essentially saying, look, we're not going to go after every import and export of the US, but there are some very, very few sectors. And in particular circumstances, we're going to prohibit you from exporting. And semiconductors towards China has been a big one. But then towards the last part of the sample, you can see a lot of action from China doing it in reverse. The green area that opens up are firms reporting being affected by export controls, mostly on rare earths, imposed by China towards the US. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to dig much deeper in this. Okay, these are sort of simple headline results that you could have probably gotten even without an LLM, at least particularly the simple mentions. Getting to the countries that are imposing and towards whom is already a lot more complicated. But here's what, where the paper starts to come alive. Imagine that we start to think about which countries are imposing the pressure and using what and towards whom. So on the left and the right columns, you can see the countries that in the data set get reported as imposing the pressure. So the US and China account for a lot, particularly for export controls. And then on the right, I have the countries receiving the pressure. And you can see that China, the US, and Russia are big destinations for the pressure. But then you can start thinking about, okay, what are they using? In particular, which sectors of the economy are they using? And here you see a lot of concentration. If you think about like how many sectors an economy has, these are, semiconductors is 44% of all of the instances of pressure. Now, to be clear, here in semiconductors, I'm counting a whole bunch of different things as the entire supply chain, including some of the minerals. But then you can see metals and minerals, which are largely the rare earths part, coming next. And if you look at sort of try to map it, who's using which part, one thing that clearly stands out is the US using semiconductors towards China and China using rare earths towards the US. But then, of course, you can map the entire multilateral systems of the pressure. And you can get it down to the firm level, which is what I'm going to go next. But the first thing I wanted to do was to try to think more systematically of how does this relate to, for example, our existing theory of which sectors, which countries use on which other countries to apply pressure? And you can look at sanctions in a similar way. You can say, look, when I look at imposing sanctions, Russia is the big destination, oil and gas is a big part of it, and then semiconductors against toward China. I'm going to skip tariffs for a second because I'm going to come back to it at the end. Okay, so how would you think about relating this to the theory? Well, in our previous theory, we derived formulas that are this kind, which are relatively common in the trade literature. You can think of, for example, the ACR formula for trade. They're saying, look, if I'm a country and I'm country J, and I am trying to affect country N, what is it most powerful in terms of cutting them off? What threats really get a lot of response? Well, the basic theory is threats of suspending inputs to your export controls, for example, that are a big part of the target expenditure, that have a low elasticity of substitution, so that they can get the same things very easily somewhere else. And of course, this last part is those inputs where you, as the country applying the pressure, control the vast majority of the inputs. And if you think about this formula, it's very nonlinear. So in the news, there's a lot of mention of choke points. And a theory rendition of a choke point is nothing else than a sector that you control on a country that you want to influence, that has a combination of you control the vast majority of those inputs, and there's a low elasticity of substitution. So whatever you don't control, it's a relatively poor substitute for what you control and what the country needs. And you can see that a choke point is nothing else than a very non-linear part of this formula. Let me do the next slide, and then I'm going to pause and see if there are questions. How do we relate the soft data to this? Well, the way to think about this is that in our previous work, we essentially observe these objects. These are expenditures, measures in the data. These are, in some senses, hard bilateral trade data and estimates coming from the literature of the elasticity of substitution. So these things give me a prediction that you should be, whenever I look at a bilateral relationship and there is exertion of pressure, it is most likely that you're going to use things where the pressure has a big effect. So those things for which this formula says you should have a lot of power. And we can measure this in our previous work, and now we can relate it to our new work using LLMs, and it measures the left-hand side. And so we're thinking about, is it true that in the data, I find that countries over which our previous theories would say you have the most power in particular sectors are also in the ones where the firms reporting that indeed most of the pressure is being applied. So, think of it as in a simplistic way, is the US using things like semiconductors, finance, things that they really control and for which there is no other substitute? Or is he using just as much things that we don't think they should be using? For example, plain vanilla manufacturing, where the US controls very little of it, and probably the elasticity of substitution is something like 10. And so you don't think that the target is going to suffer almost at all if you cut them off from that input. And we find some pretty strong evidence that this is going on. I would take it with a grain of salt, one, because these results are still provisional, two, because we would like to do a lot more in terms of the cross-section. But there's certainly, the way I think about it is when I look back to these graphs, these aren't random sectors. These are sectors that are being used for a reason, and a reason that our theory would have predicted. So let me pause for a second before I go on and see if there are any questions.
Matteo, Matteo, we have a question from Jamel Sadawi.
Two small points. The first one is about how this geoeconomic pressures relate with true geopolitical events, because you have some salient geopolitical events, diplomatic geopolitical turning points, some specific events that should drive, in terms of causality, the adoption of some of this geoeconomic pressure. Not all of these, but some of these. So I would like to understand what is the conception of causality. And the second small point is about the problem of translation, because for Chinese firms, reports made by Anglo-Saxon analysts in English may miss some perception about the risk, or maybe it doesn't matter too much. So two small questions. Maybe we can also discuss them at the end. Thank you.
Yeah, great. So let me give you some preliminary answers now, and then I'm happy to get more into them. So in terms of the translation and the coverage, so let me distinguish sort of very different levels. One is the more mechanical, which is the documents that we use for the transcripts are in English. The ones coming from Capital IQ and WRDS, I believe that they require, although I could be wrong about this, I believe that they require the conference call to be in English in order for them to cover it. That's certainly not true for the data that we have for China. For those ones, we observe both the Chinese transcript and the English one. The English translation, I think, is provided to us, and so we're taking it. What we haven't experimented yet, which we would like to experiment with, is for models like QN, which have multilingual capabilities, is whether we get different answers by running the model directly on the Chinese text or not, or, for example, having the model perform the translation. It's something that I'm very curious about. We just haven't done it. that's, I would say the narrower part of the answer that is more about the translation itself. There is a 2 levels up of much broader concerns that are, number one, the selection of which firms will have a text and in English, and which firms will talk to foreign investors. At the very beginning of the talk, I gave a very prominent example, which is the disappearance of the Russian firms on the data set as they get more heavily sanctioned, which is a real concern since it's endogenous to the pressure. That's where we try to use the analyst reports to get a much wider coverage and much more stable across countries. That brings to the last point, which is we're not taking a stand on whether the analysts, for example, are very good at covering what they need to cover. You could imagine that it's very difficult for any Western analyst right now to know exactly what is going on with the Russian firms. And that is a concern and not one that we can do a ton about. The best that we can do is try to look at different sources of text and see if we get very consistent answers. I wouldn't, rule out that there is some, problem of the crowds and they're all looking at each other, but that's the best that we can do on that one. On the first part, now we're taking no stand at all on causality. This is not a paper that is trying to say, I have a theory of which countries are not going to get along and you're going to see the pressure. This is simply saying, given the pressure, I want to look at what the firms are responding. The only part I did, which was a cross-sectional argument, is saying conditional on me wanting to pressure you, which of the sectors do I use, which is about the cross-section conditional on wanting to exert pressure, not about whether I want to exert pressure overall. So there's just no claims about causality at that level. And I think there was another question, if I remember correctly.
So the question was, are you taking into account also pressures or the use of the transport sector, including maritime transportation, air transportation?
Yes,
so
absolutely.
As part of the analysis.
Here it is. Transportation equipment and transports are part of this. So they show up very often in sanctions on Russia. That will show up. The maritime Greek sector will talk a lot about it, for example. So that will show up very prominently. What I think is a little bit more difficult, and we're trying to experiment with, is when you think of, for example, the payment system, the firm might say, I cannot buy the following inputs. And it's difficult for us to know whether that's because the inputs are prohibited or you can't make the payment. So the boundary between a financial and a real sanction or a trade sanction is somewhat blurry in the data because the firms will just report that they cannot do this. We don't know whether in the background is due to a financial sanction or a specific trade sanction.
Just Matteo, I just have one very small question.
Yeah, go for it.
So it's related to the data source. So you are using earning calls and analyst reports. And my question is related to the fact that they may be biased because, earning calls, it's like a central bank announcement is very, very standardized and we don't want to afraid the market or market participants. And then we don't want to say or communicate on the fact that we are sanctioned or not, or we could be affected by such political event or something like that. So do you think it should be a concern?
Yes, in fact, I can give you 3 answers. The first one is my personal view, which is I was very concerned about this. And I was very concerned, particularly in terms of export controls. Sorry, in terms of the earning calls for precisely the reasons that you mentioned. Like you're a professional CEO, you have a PR team, you're going to try to skirt the questions. That was my big push to use analysts because they don't have that concern. In fact, their career incentives are to get it right. If you have a scoop that the firm is trying to dodge these questions, you want to talk about it. So that I made a very big push among the quotas for this. I can tell you ex post that the results are very, very similar across the 2 types of sources. Part of the, and these I should say, it's not true for China, or I should be more careful. I cannot say it for China because we don't have a lot of analyst reports. I can say it for the Western markets. Now deeper down, there are lots of people, including Tarek and co-authors, that have worked on this for a long time. And I think one of the reasons that the literature is built on this type of text is, in practice, these concerns are there, but also you're on the record as a sitting CEO of a publicly listed firm. You have to disclose material risks. There is reputational costs if you say that everything is fine, and then in 2 weeks we're going to discover that indeed everything wasn't fine and you knew about it. So there are limits to the concern of pure PR and shit talk that come both from reputation and from legal requirements. And so in practice, there's a longer literature way before my own impressions and work that have established that this is a pretty good text, even with all the caveats we have in mind. But for me, I got a lot of comfort from seeing very similar results across two different sets of people speaking about the same events. But yeah, I think it's a very natural concern. The one I still have, and that, for now it's gone untested, and maybe we can do more about it, is like things like bias from foreign analysts when they look at a particular country. There might be a difference between the locals and the foreigners and how they're assessing the situation. There's plenty of reasons to believe that might be going on. So I don't think that this is the final word. I was more just shocked, given the outward shift in the technology of what is feasible with LLMs in the last 2 years, how much can be done, even with all the caveats. Okay, so let me show you.
Thank you very much.
Part of what I thought was, at least to me, what I've learned a lot, and what I thought it was just shocking what you could do with LLMs. So the part that is really rich about a large language model, if you don't know deeply what I'm already about these models, is the cross-attention mechanism, and the idea that the model is taking into account the entire structure of a sentence, potentially of words that are very, very far apart, and is putting weights on them. And in some sense, it has learned through the training how to think about the full structure of the sentence in extracting information, which is very different from a trivial approach that you open a PDF and you do a command find for the word tariffs. Or you can go, there's an increasing level of sophistication in natural language processing, and LLMs are towards the far end of both the complexity and therefore some of the opacity, but also the ability to think through a much more complicated structure of a sentence. Now, in our context, where does that really show up? Is we can ask things like, in response to this pressure, what did you do? And across very narrowly defined interesting objects for economics. So you can see here on the axis I have, did you increase or decrease the input price, the sales price, in which country, investment, domestic investment, R&D, the quantity of input and sales, the profit margin. So we have 55 of these here. I'm only showing you a few. And that a few years ago would have been totally out of the question in terms of frontier of research. So that's really what the shift in the frontier of research coming from LLM is coming. It's coming about. And of course, there's questions about noise, which I'm going to get into. So let me start with the three instruments that we focus on: tariffs, sanctions, and export controls. You can see them. First, here I'm checking the net effect. So the net effect, they're all flags. So if an input, if you're positive affected, is a +1. If you're not affected, is a 0. If you're negative affected, is a -1. And I'm summing across the firms. So you can see that overall, these things are privately costly for the firms. They report across firms, the vast majority are negatively affected. But then you start thinking about input and sales prices. Now here you already see a big difference between tariffs and, for example, export controls. Like a tariff is an ad valorem tax on imports. An export control is a quantity restriction. And you can see that for tariffs, the firms are facing higher input prices, and at the same time, increasing their sales price. And I'm going to get more into this when I analyze the trade war, much more so than for the other two instruments. When you look at instead investment, domestic investment in R&D, you find a very strong response to export controls. And I'm going to zero in a second about this, and you will see that this is all the Chinese firms that are reporting doing a lot of domestic investment in R&D to get around the export controls on semiconductors imposed by the US. When you look at quantities, sanctions tend to have a bigger response, and then you can see that the profit margins are going down, which is consistent with the firm being negatively affected. You can do a lot more. You can, for example, say, look, I want to think differently about the domestic firms of the country who's imposing the pressure versus the firms in the country that is the target of the pressure. I don't want to commingle them. So when you look at tariffs, for example, you can see a huge spike on the left here, where US firms, since the tariffs in this case are imposed largely by the US, are reporting facing higher prices on their imports, so the input price, and also increasing sales prices. When you look at the firms receiving the country, the pressure, you can see the big response of R&D, which I'm going to get into. This is going to be the Chinese firms. This is something that we just discussed in the paper. We redid everything using the analyst reports rather than the earnings calls. And here's the graph I just showed you. It looks entirely similar with the exception that we don't find a strong R&D effect, and that's precisely because it's concentrated in Chinese firms, and our analyst reports don't really cover China very well. So this is a country effect. If you eliminate the country, it looks identical. And we report all of this in the appendix of the paper. Now you can go a little deeper and say, how are the firms reshuffling their supply chains? In particular, for example, in response to US tariffs. And if you look at the American firms, they're saying that they're reallocating away from China and they're allocating towards domestic, but also you can see a little bit of Mexico and Vietnam. This is sort of the rerouting of China for us. When you look at the Chinese firms, in response to these tariffs, they're reporting moving away from China itself and from the US, but then they're also reporting, in some sense, this is churning. They're going towards the same countries. And then a big shift is towards Vietnam, Thailand, and Malaysia. And this is essentially China trying to go through the rest of East Asia to eventually re-export to the US market. If you look at Russian firms in response to sanctions, this is where I mentioned we had to switch data source because you kind of lose these firms. You find a lot of what has been also in the news, which is big reallocations towards China and massively away from, of course, the US and the EU. These are the countries imposing the sanctions. But you can also see India here. That's the other, that's in the news a lot since yesterday. They're big buyers of Russian oil, but you can see Kazakhstan showing up probably as a conduit country trying to bypass the sanctions. Now, the trade war is kind of fun. We were writing this paper. In fact, I think we had the first draft just completed very roughly when April 2nd occurred. And so we immediately started sort of updating everything. And it's been fun to see how it updates also almost in real time. So this graph is concentrating on a fraction of the firms that are reporting negative impact versus positive impact. And these are US firms from tariffs imposed by the US. And you can see an overwhelmingly fraction of the firm reports that they're negative. Now, there are some that reports positive effects, and I'm going to focus on what these are. If you're a trade economist, this is essentially the domestic producer subsidy. These are going to be firms that say, look, my competitors are much more affected than me because they import much more than me, and I'm either going to grab market share or I'm going to increase markups because I might be able to raise my price as they pass through some of the tariffs to their customers, and that's going to increase my markups. So steel mills in the US are going to be a typical example, okay? But you can go deeper and you can say, look, let me look at two types of firms. There are firms that report having been negatively affected and firms that report being positively affected in the US. Let me look at how they react to the tariffs differentially by these two types. So the very first obvious fact is, of course, the firms that report negatively are consistently also reporting lower profit margins, and the other one are reporting higher profit margins. But to me, the most striking part of the action was really here. You can see that the firms that are reporting negative are much more likely to report seeing input prices go up, and they're passing on some of that, but almost just as much as the firms that report being positively affected. But the difference is pretty striking. So to me, this looks like they're getting squeezed on the profit margin because they cannot pass through the entire tariff and they're absorbing some of it. It's a difficult statement to make because these are flags of 0-1. So these are not quantity statements with how much are you facing an increase in input prices, or how much can you increase sales prices. But it certainly paints a consistent picture. And you can also see that the firms that are positively affected are increasing domestic investment. And these are essentially the firms that are saying, look, we're getting protectionism, we're getting higher markups, we're being protected from foreign competition, we're boosting our domestic investment, which was perhaps what the administration wanted. Now, in the last few minutes, I'm going to talk about something that hasn't come up a lot, but I think should be a concern in the literature, and we're experimenting with it, which is, this is a new and unfamiliar technology to most economists. And if you think about what I did at the beginning, which was feed documents, a prompt into an LLM and get a structured data set, the main worry you're going to have is that structured data set, noisy, biased. I don't think that my takeaway is that as researchers, we shouldn't simply say these technologies are magic and they provide the absolute truth and I should just run with the outputs. I think of them as they're expanding the frontier of what we can do. They come with their own problems and we have to assess them and in context decide how we're going to deal with these problems. So here we're going to think about an approach where we're using perturbations in either the prompt or the model to think about the variation in the results. So that, the cheapest one to understand is, please, I think there's a question.
I was just getting ready for the end. I don't want to interrupt now, but later on.
Okay,
no, Charles.
Okay.
Okay.
No worries. I will then conclude and then we can start that. So one way to think about, the simplest way to think about it is fix the document, fix the prompt, use Llama, use QN, use Gemma, use whatever other model you will like, see if you get different answers. Okay? That's pretty intuitive. The other one that I also find intuitive is, imagine that you and I sit down and we change the way we wrote the prompt in a way that we could largely agree a human will interpret it as it's asking exactly the same task. It's just phrased slightly different. Does that create an issue? And of course, it's a bit of a soft statement. So the question is, what is sufficiently different? And how far can you push it before the results break? But we try to experiment a little bit with this. And one simple way to think about what I'm going to show you is to go back to some reliability statistics that have been used a lot before. So if you think of something having a fixed effect, a signal, and some noise, that's your observation. You're really interested in eta I, but you have the problem that there is some noise in there. And the reliability statistics are nothing else that the ratio of the variance of the signal to the variance of the signal plus noise. And there's a reason why they're used. If this was pure classical measurement error, this would be tightly related to the bias in an OLS regression if you put these things on the right-hand side. There's no reason to believe that the measurement error is classical per se. If it was classical per se, by the way, for this particular paper, I would be a lot less concerned because a lot of the time we're interested in having these measures on the left-hand side and not on the right-hand side of a regression. But that's not true in a general setup. But they're pretty easy to interpret. So a 1 would be great news. It would be very reliable. It's all of the variation is in the signal. Very little is in the noise. A 0 would be pretty bad news. here we're somewhere in the middle. So to give you a sense, this is comparable to what you will get in high quality survey data that it's routinely used in economics. So it's not something, it's not, to me personally, my gut reaction right now is that this is not the level of noise where you put, a simple footnote and ignore it because almost all data sets have some imperfections. This is enough noise that you have to really confront these issues, and I would like to think harder about them. But I also don't subscribe to the overreacting the other way and saying, well, since they're noisy, they should never be used. In fact, we use tons of noisy data all the time in economics, and we think about appropriate ways with either instruments or ways to correct for potential measurement error and bias. And I think this literature is very active, and I think we're going to see some progress. We're going to try to think harder ourselves and experiment with it. Okay, so there's a lot more that we're doing about this. I'm not going to bother you with what's coming next. As we do it, you'll see it. But overall, I hope that this was sort of interesting to you. It's something quite new, at least to me, of how to do large-scale inference using LLMs in a way that is replicable. I didn't really talk about replicability a lot, so let me mention 2 words here. If you think of replicability in the narrow sense of, if I press the button twice with the same data and the same code, do I get the same answer? That one I think is fairly straightforward to guarantee by, for example, making these models very greedy and reduce the sampling. Okay, so that we can guarantee. There's a different problem with replicability that has to do with open weights versus closed weights models. When you use a closed weights model, like you're sending something to ChatGPT, if they change the model in the background, you have no control. We only use open weights models. So these are, it's like having the parameters of a model on your machine. They're not going anywhere. Forever and ever, they will sit there on my machine and they will produce the same results. There are, intricacies that have to do with the compute architecture, but to a large extent, what I just said is the right conclusion. That comes with its own cost. These models are large. We have to use a supercomputer, a blade, a Stanford with GPUs and all of this. But also these costs are going down very, very fast as the technology improves. So we wanted to really focus on this, being one of the early papers, particularly in economics, that tries to do this. I thought we should set up, the bar high and not say, look, we just send this stuff on the internet. For those of you that also want to do this, one advantage of open weights local models is if you use data that is commercial, proprietary, anything that you couldn't send to an open internet API, this one will satisfy those requirements. And that's a large part, I suspect, of research in economics. On the economic side, I mean, my takeaway was I was just shocked what can now be done in using these models and text. I would like to do a lot more. In the particular confines of what I showed you today, I think it was pretty interesting, at least to me, to being able to see who's applying the pressure to whom, how are the firms reacting, how are they reacting depending on which instruments and which sectors are being affected. And I think, I suspect that we're going to keep going on this for a long time. Let me stop here and take questions.
Yes. So please raise your hand for asking your questions. Matteo, thank you very much. It was a fantastic presentation. So we have a question from Charles Lichfield. Please, Charles, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Yeah, Charles Lichfield from the Atlantic Council Geoeconomic Center. Thank you for the presentation. I was wondering whether you tested on other sectors. So I know you looked at ASML as an example, but in our work, we've seen the financial sector as one of the sectors that is perhaps most at risk of suffering from reasons being created not to work through the Western financial sector. So we impose sanctions. This may create some problems for China and for Russia, but it also creates the incentive to work around our systems. I think the same could be said of chips in a completely so. Those would be goods and not services, but I think you have a similar phenomenon. So I was wondering how you would go about using your very impressive LLM to see if that's being confirmed, because it's more to do with the targeted behavior rather than the sanctioner's behavior. But how would you use this to test this phenomenon?
Yeah, so let me divide the answer into three. First, I mean, I couldn't agree more. A lot of our previous work was precisely on the financial infrastructure as being used for geoeconomic pressure, precisely because I can mention theories where what matters is share of these that you control, elasticity of substitutions, and you can think of things like Swift as being precisely something where there's very little alternative, so the elasticity of substitution is very low. Everybody uses it, and you control it almost entirely if you're the Western world, and so you want to use it in sanctions because it's or in exerting pressure because it's powerful. On the other hand, it gives rise to incentives for fragmentation because the target understands it and is going to react by wanting to look for an alternative, and even for a poor alternative, but for something else that is going to be a lifeline, and endogenously they'll build it. So the framework is very much about that. Now, in the confines of the second part of the question, which is what this paper does, we're looking at all sectors of the economy. So with some important exceptions, which I want to think of, highlight that these are public firms. And so they don't have to be representative of the underlying economy. You might think that some sectors or some countries are much less likely to have public firms that do things like an investor conference call, or even that will have a professional analyst cover them. So where does it show up, for example, is we don't find much action in Africa. Now, we know from other work that there's a lot of debt diplomacy from China in Africa. I think part of that is really a coverage issue rather than, we don't find the result. Now, going deeper into the financial services, we do find a lot of evidence of financial sanctions in the data and of them biting. What I don't think we find a lot, and you will see why, is firms discussing the payment system. And that precisely has to do with the public nature. Like JP Morgan will not talk about the payment system affecting their profits, because Swift is a Belgian cooperative. And Swift itself is not a public firm that is listed, and is not going to talk about, we might see lower profits because China's introducing SIPs. So you really have to think about this paper as focused on public firms. And now where does it show up? It shows up in Russian firms or other firms saying, we're being faced with issues that have to do with not being able to transport oil or make payments or buy the goods because of financial sanctions. And so you see the flip side of that. But as I mentioned during the talk, it's somewhat hard to distinguish, not because of their LLM, but in the text itself, when a firm says, I couldn't buy this input, whether the restriction is the input itself or the fact that you couldn't make a payment to buy it. And sometimes we sort of struggle in the text, even as a human, figuring out the difference. One of the things that we're exploring is at some point, not in this project, to use more general text, for example, the news or other things. And those will have a lot more, imagine you're at the Atlantic Council, imagine that I get, all of the reports that a think tank writes and go through them. Now, the reason we don't want to go there is because there might be confirmation bias. We all think that these things are important, and so you talk about it. So you want a text that is sufficiently neutral, but at the same time, you might want to have text that is much more about government policy than firm policy, and some of these things will show up in there more prominently.
Thank you.
Another question from Okuntaka.
Hello, hi. Very interesting. I was wondering more about the time series variation in the data, and especially with regards to your theory on, how governments might optimally pressure, put this pressure on other countries, depending on the size of the sector in that country, depending on whether the threatening country has a big supply power in that sector, etc. I was wondering if you could look into how this mentality of using economic power for this kind of like political reasons have changed over time. If you kind of separately estimate that model over different types of presidencies, for instance, or like recently versus in the past, so to see like how that kind of mindset of using these tactics have shifted over time from a maybe more maybe trade was more based on principles before, but then more recently we are seeing more and more of this type of strategic usage of trade. I wonder if you can capture that.
Yeah, I think that's a super interesting question. So the short answer is, in the confines of the corporate text, that's much more limiting because corporate text doesn't go back 50 years. So we get good text starting in, say, 03, 05, certainly by the global financial crisis. Now, within that time sample, I mean, I showed you at the beginning, you see a drastic change where, for example, mentions of export controls as being a concern skyrocket towards like 2012, 14, tariffs the same. So you certainly see what you would imagine, which is there has been a major return to these instruments, particularly in the US in recent years. Now that's a sample of two, so it certainly highlights, for example, in tariffs, the two Trump's administration, but I wouldn't call it a regression. It just, there's two administrations from Trump in the data. What I think would be interesting and something that potentially we're working on and would like to do is looking at different type of text, like I was mentioning before, that can go back like a century, and there you can get much more of what you have in mind. When I look at different countries, different bilateral relationships, how did that change? Now there are issues. One of the lovely things about corporate text is that each report is about one firm or one sector. So I can link that firm to all of the hard data that we have on firms very easily. If you think instead of like much more unstructured text that is like a newspaper article about potentially 10 different countries and 20 different firms, or a congressional report, even identifying correctly which country, which firm are they actually talking about, it's an enterprise on its own. But I think it's something that we're interested in doing precisely for the reasons you have in mind.
Thank you very much for your question. So we have another question from Akiva. Can you hear me?
Okay. Could you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So I'm wondering if there's some concern of sort of, I mean, this may have been almost touched on, of sort of kind of a Lucas critique, in the sense that once, at least for firms, for the earnings calls, once they understand that the texts are being used to analyze how they're reacting to the measures, to the tariffs, or to the sanctions, it'll affect what they say. It'll affect what they say in the earnings calls, because they know that Matteo is doing this kind of analysis and will be drawing conclusions even at the micro level as to what. So is there a concern about that?
Yeah, I think that concern has been present for a long time. I mean, if you think about it, these are the firm is. They're not really concerned about me. I suspect they're much more concerned about the fact that the participants in the call are major investors and analysts, and they're going to make recommendations about the firm and their analyst reports based on that call. So that was always there. And I think there's a long literature in, say, accounting and also in economics, looking at that. My takeaway from it, which is consistent with what we found, is that those concerns are there, but they're limited from the fact that ultimately you have a responsibility as a CEO to disclose material risks that are affecting the firms, and also that you are a public firm, you're reporting. So if you're doing badly and you're getting hit massively in the profits, you have to disclose it. I'll give you an example. Okay, I'm sure that NVIDIA was not happy about the US imposing export controls on its chip towards China. And I'm sure because their CEO has said it publicly. I'm also sure that the CEO and the company announced taking multi-billion-dollar charges on the balance sheets to account for the losses due to these policies. And so in some sense, they have to disclose that these losses are occurring. You're still correct that if you look at, for example, the transcript of ASML, there's a lot of careful wording from the CEO about what they're saying and not saying. And they're not going to say explicitly, in diplomatic conversations, our country was threatened with this or that. I think that's where the analyst reports are probably more candid. That's why we use them. Overall, as I said, we didn't find major differences in the results. These are also, I would say, high-level results. So the fact that you don't find the differences here doesn't mean that there isn't a bias as you go much farther down in the sort of. If I was measuring the extent to which this was happening, there might be a 10% bias. That I would certainly not see it here. But in the overall broad patterns, I was pretty satisfied with that.
Very interesting. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Akiva, for the question. So if we have any additional questions, please feel free to raise your hand. I have one or two. So let's start with one technical, but I just want to come back to one comment from Jamel about, this kind of identification and causality. And I'm wondering if it is relevant or not, just tell me, to add some control variables and to make some maybe additional estimations, because some features of the dynamics, and this with your capital allocation projects, are deeply related to the macroeconomic situation of each country and their bilateral interrelationships. I may be wrong, but I'm just wondering that some things that could be perceived as tariffs or sanctions could just be a simple change in reallocation or macroeconomic reallocation.
Yes, this is actually it's a great question. So let me distinguish two parts. The first part is absolutely. I mean, think of what this project has done as showing a technique in this particular context to get unstructured data into a structured data set. The analysis that we actually provided of the structured data set is intentionally very, very simple. It requires little more than plots and investigating basic patterns, because we wanted to show you what an LLM would do in a very transparent way. So think of it as the data set comes out and we're largely plotting it in interesting dimensions, but we intentionally decided to stay away from doing long panel regressions with lots of controls, because I think that these techniques are sufficiently unfamiliar that then it will become a little harder to see what the naked answers of the LLM were. That doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of value from doing that. In some sense, once you turn this into a structured data set with the caveat of the measurement error, all of the standard analysis starts. And here we're intentionally sort of in this paper staying away from that. But that also limits the number of things that you can say. The second part, which I think I'm infinitely excited about, but I confess I haven't really converged, is causality. And it's a very different way to think about causality. Why? Because in phrasing the question, we're asking, does the firm report taking this action directly as a consequence of the policy? So in principle, in the wording of the question, we're eliminating the typical concern with endogeneity of, look, I was increasing my investment for totally unrelated reason. It also turned out that I got sanctioned. And so if you were running a regression where you have investment and sanctions, you would say, look, I have a problem because the reason why they were increasing their investment has got nothing to do with the fact that they got sanctioned. Here we're saying, does the firm say that they're taking this action in response to the sanction? And so it's almost like a verbal approach to causal identification, where the firm itself is telling it that the policy is causing them to do this. Now, the extent to which that's correct or not, but it's a very different way to the typical way we think about in the hard data. And we were pretty strict in designing the prompt in saying, please do not assign general market variation, general conditions, normal behavior of the firm to these policies. The firm has to explicitly tell you that it's in response to this. And as you can imagine, all of our time was spent inspecting the original text versus the output. And I have to say, it works remarkably well. So I never thought about it this way, but this is opening up a different way to do causal identification, which is sort of like almost asking you, like, did you do this after the seminar because you spoke to Matteo? And you say yes or no. And so we kind of have a clean identification set up, modulo the concerns about cheap talk and all that. I think, if anybody knows of econometrics papers in this route, I do have to go to speak to my colleagues in econometrics and sort of, I would like to think more formally about this. It just seems such an interesting area to explore.
Yeah, indeed. Really, but you also raised during your reply another point that could be very interesting to avoid or check is the policy response. So you have a macro shock, and you have a geopolitical shock, and in the same time you have a policy response. Could be a political response, it could be a central bank response, it could be a fiscal response. And then it's quite, in my opinion, complicated to identify this stuff into the earning calls. But indeed, it's
let me give you an example that worries me about that, which is imagine that the monetary policy response of China to export controls in the US is to offer big subsidies for firms that are developing alternative technologies. The firm itself might reply and say, I am doing this action in response to the export controls of the US. And, somewhat this is true, but directly, I might be most influenced from the fact that I'm receiving very large subsidies from the Chinese government in response to US sanctions. And I'm not sure that I have not checked, but I would say that my prior, for whatever is worth, which is, generally little in research, is I doubt that an LLM will be able to systematically extract that, because I doubt that the firms will even carefully articulate in the text the sequence of those events in their head. And so that's going to definitely be a struggle.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Very, very interesting replies, and also the tool that you presented, because it's a new way to have a look to these geoeconomic and the dynamics. So now I just want to ask a question on the side of the and how we can use, how your tool could be used for policy management or monitoring. I think I see the point, but do you have any advice for a central bank that may be related to geoeconomic pressures or stuff like that?
My sense is that these tools, a few years from now, will be routine. These things start at the frontier, we're unfamiliar with them, and eventually they get more and more routine, and we understand their plus and minuses. I would say a couple of things. First is, I don't want the presentation to come across as if this was like a daunting process. I think any of the people in this call, and certainly a professional, commercial bank or central bank, can do this. As of now, relatively straightforward. As usual, as academics, we push the limits and we try to be very careful and make it super replicable and all this. But I don't want this to come across as more complicated than it actually is. And certainly the private sector around the area where I live, it's way ahead of the game of what we do. In fact, we use their models. They're available on the internet. I mean, you can go and download them and use them. I think so my sense is that they're going to become part of the routine, and they're going to come in two forms. One is going to be, the ability to monitor the economy in real time. I mean, Israel is clearly going through a lot of things right now, and there's a lot of interest in how exactly are the firms reacting, the foreign firms, the domestic firms, and the typical hard data that we're more familiar with lags easily 6 months, if not more. And text is very fast. It has its own shortcomings, but it would be a great idea to have it in the mix of things that you use to get a sense. In some sense, there's nothing else than a much more systematic way of the old approach of you constantly speak to firms and the private sector trying to get a sense of where the economy is heading, that every central banker has done forever. This is just a very systematic way. I think it's particularly important for things that are not as visible as, say, interest rate policy, like export controls, where you want to know which one of my firms is really getting targeted, or you might be interested in 2 or 3 steps away from your own value chain, what's happening. I know that a lot of my suppliers are in Germany, or they're in Europe, or they're in Eastern Europe, or they might be in the US. And I need to know what's happening to them to know what's happening to Israeli firms. And that's much harder to do with hard data, particularly for a small country that, it's not the IMF or a very large central bank. You can't keep tab on statistics and hard data of lots and lots of countries. And this is a good way to synthesize it. But April 2nd to me was probably the best example. I mean, immediately they were concerned on, are the American firms going to pass through the tariffs? Are they going to absorb it? Is China going to cut prices? And the hard data is going to take months to show up. But the tech shows up very fast. I mean, we were running these models almost in real time. Like 2 weeks later, we already had the first results. These days, I guess in the US, you have to be careful with updates to the data. They're subject to revisions, but good faith revisions.
I see. Thank you very much. So do we have any additional questions from the attendees? Feel free to raise your hand. So I just have one very technical question. Did you think about connecting your data from this geoeconomic pressure tool or any additional results from the geoeconomic pressure to your global capital allocation project, which collect a lot of interrelated data?
Yes.
And
we're working very actively on that, on both the financial data, the real data of the firms, the trade data, the trade micro data. I mentioned this only briefly, but one of the reasons why we started from this corporate text is because each of the documents comes with a firm identifier that can be hard mapped to all the data. So think of every data set that you know of firms, investors, securities, has the same identifiers that can connect to this text. And so it's very, very easy to do that mapping. And it would have been a lot harder if we started from, say, the news with 10 different firms where, very often they will not use the full legal name of the firm. So you can't even do name matching. This doesn't have that issue. Each transcript, I know exactly what firm it is. Any other data I can bring in. That's something that we're actively working on.
Wow, that's a fantastic agenda. Fantastic. Okay. Thank you very much, Matteo. If we don't have any additional questions, so I wish you best of luck with this fantastic and very, very interesting and policy relevant research agenda. Matteo, thank you very much for being with us and presenting us this fantastic paper.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much.